Afternoon tea, everyone. For our second, I think, last talk of the day, we have Matt Sengia speaking to us about, when I find my place in the program again, implementing diverse and inclusive codes of conduct. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Betsy.
Oh, and before I forget, sorry, Matt. Matt will be taking live questions at the end if there is time. So please put your questions in the chat at Tux Theater and preface them with question in all caps so that we can find them. Take it away, Matt.
Thank you. My name is Matt. I'm going to be talking to you about implementing diverse and inclusive codes of conduct. My pronouns are he and him. You can find me online using my handle Mattsen, MATTCEN. And all that other information on the slide there. My slides are available on GitHub. There is a link to them on at the top of each slide. And feel free to tweet about this talk. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So my background is actually as a Linux systems admin, but I spent quite a lot of time as a community organizer, and in that capacity, I've written and worked on and modified codes of conduct for several organizations. I've spent 2 years on the Linux Conf Australia safety team, and spent a bunch of time researching diversity, inclusion, and communication. I'm not a lawyer though, so please don't take any of this as legal advice. So this is a quick overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to go through the purposes of a code of conduct, how to apply it, how to respond to incidents, and we're going to review a code of conduct to get an idea of how ideal it is. So the Professional Accountants in Business Committee defines a code of conduct as principles, values, standards, or rules of behaviour that guide the decisions, procedures, and systems of an organisation in a way that A, contributes to the welfare of its key stakeholders, and B, respects the rights of all constituents affected by its operations. So codes of conduct are especially important for new people in the community, and marginalised and underrepresented community members such as underrepresented genders or sexualities, abilities, races, and religions. Codes of conduct need to apply to everyone within your community. If they don't apply equally to everyone, then they're not going to do their job and they're going to create a power imbalance. So if you're developing a code of conduct, your community leadership has to be on board with it. So, what do you put in a code of conduct? The ideal things to have in your code of conduct are, what is this code of conduct for? What is our intent with having a code of conduct? Where does this code of conduct apply? Does it apply to, if we're having an in-person event, does it only apply to the event itself? Does it apply to the online spaces surrounding the event, such as chat rooms, mailing lists, or use of communication between code attendees on Twitter? So defining that scope is important. You should include what is defined as unacceptable behaviour according to your code of conduct, so people have a clear guideline of this is unacceptable within this community. And you should include consequences of violation of those behaviours. So how are you going to respond to those kinds of violations? And what different severities are there? You should also include information on how and to whom incidents should be reported. This should be, ideally it makes sense to have a reasonable detail about this process, including what kind of information might need to be included. So having a template for that it would be ideal. You should also list who is going to be handling reports, and this ideally should include individual names for the people who are doing that. This can help to ensure that people might trust certain people on the committee of people who is organising the code of conduct. People might trust some people over others, or there might be one of the people on that team who is actually been involved in an incident, and people need to know, that is the case. So you also, ideally, you should be making a commitment to take reports seriously, and to recuse members who have people who are handling any incidents that may have a conflict of interest. So somebody who might be the partner of the person who is reporting the incident, or one of the people who was being accused of something, or whatever. Just being aware of how that kind of stuff might play out, and it may not be an issue, but it may be a perceived issue. So potentially keeping those people out of the decision process would be best. It also makes sense to include emergency contact details for emergency services for wherever you are. If you look at the way the Linux Australia Code of Conduct has been presented for the past 2 days, you can see that it also included emergency services information for places all around the world. So that's a really great way of just reminding people of that information. And any related documents that might be similar to your code of conduct, that might kind of be adjacent to it. For example, here is the etiquette to use on a mailing list, and here is how best to reach out to other attendees if you'd like to make contact with them. That should not be necessarily within your code of conduct, because you want to kind of keep it fairly decluttered and easy to read, but it is totally fine to link to that information from your code of conduct if you think it's sufficiently related. So how does a code of conduct work? A code of conduct works by education, which describes the expected standards of behavior; norm following, which is a kind of peer pressure based on other people's behavior to ensure that people are exhibiting the behavior that you want to see, and other people can see it being exhibited and are therefore more likely to follow it. Attraction and repulsion, which is to say that people will self-select into or out of your community based on your code of conduct. If somebody is interested in joining your community and part of your processes include showing them the code of conduct before they join, they might look at it and say, oh, actually, I don't feel comfortable adhering to this code of conduct, or I don't trust this code of conduct, or whatever, and they will just not join your community in the first place. And then, you've got a whole lot of problems that you don't have to deal with a mismatch in expectations and desires. Deterrence is another feature which creates consequences for unacceptable behavior. And boundary setting, which keeps unsafe people outside of the community. For example, if they behave unacceptably and you need to exclude somebody from your community to keep the rest of your community safe, that's a reasonable boundary for you to try and set. The paradox of tolerance states that a tolerant society must be tolerant of everything except intolerance itself. And this is something to keep in mind when crafting a code of conduct, because while ideally we want to be able to be tolerant of all things, that also means that we're intolerant of things that are harmful to people. So if a community tolerates intolerance, it will eventually be taken over by the intolerant. So applying a code of conduct helps to protect a tolerant community from that destruction. So a code of conduct does have limits. It cannot punish wrongdoing. Because code of conducts are not law, and the communities in which we are trying to apply them are not equivalent to wider society. That is a whole different scope to a law for, or in a state or country or whatever. So the only thing that a code of conduct can do insofar as punishment is excluding harmful people from the community. Anything that might be considered illegal needs to be deferred to law enforcement and handled outside of that scope. Your volunteers or people who are implementing your code of conduct do not necessarily have the training or the time to commit to that kind of work. Further, code of conduct can't really implement transformative or restorative justice. That's best suited for a society where exclusion from that society would harm both an individual and the society. because of the difference between society as a whole and any given community that a code of conduct is applied to, transformative and restorative justice aren't necessarily going to work in that environment. They cannot protect communities from external harm. Again, that requires a lot of training and a lot of effort, and it's not a thing that is necessarily worth you putting that time in for. Setting boundaries on what your code of conduct is capable of doing is important so that you don't burn out your volunteers or your members who are dealing with the code of conduct. So keep it so that it only works within your community. Codes of conduct can't mediate. The trouble with mediation is that it changes the question, what do we do about this harmful person, to, oh, well, let's try and help these two people get along because they're not getting along. And if we can't help them getting along, oh well, it's just a conflict between two people. It's not indicative of a problem within our community. And that means that you're not keeping the rest of the community safe. And finally, codes of conduct cannot force apologies or forgiveness. These things only work if they are voluntary, sincere, and demonstrate an understanding of wrongdoing and a commitment to improve. You can't, I've seen people, particularly talking to children, say, oh, say sorry for that thing that you have just done to that person. But if it's not, if it's not sincere, then it's kind of empty. And so we need to leave that kind of stuff to people to volunteer to do. So a quick summary. Codes of conduct both protect and apply to all members of the community. They should list goals, unacceptable behaviours, consequences, and reporting instructions or process, as well as related documents. They work via education, norm following, attraction and repulsion, deterrence and boundary setting. Tolerating intolerance will lead to badness. And codes of conduct cannot be easily used to punish, enact justice, operate outside the community, or force apologies or forgiveness. So, how do we apply a code of conduct? I have a really dry throat. Okay. So, when it comes to applying a code of conduct, the first thing that makes sense to do is to publish it, after you've written it, that is. Ideally, it should be one of the first things that your community members see. This makes it easy for you to say, if somebody does behave, in a way that is contrary to your code of conduct, it's easier for you to be able to say, hey, you agreed to this when you signed up, so we're not going to accept the excuse that you didn't know this was unacceptable behavior. So ideally, it should be easy to find. It should be maybe on the top level website menu or linked from the footers of emailing lists. If you've got a physical event, posting it on posters around the venue or links to it, at least. And referencing it as a required reading for community sign-up forms is also useful. When it comes to actually putting your code of conduct into practice, it makes sense to have a code of conduct committee or a safety team. So this team responds to incident reports. This team needs to be supported by the community leadership and not overruled by leadership except in very rare circumstances. And for the most part, the leadership should be able to trust the conduct committee to do their job and not step in and take over. Ideally, a safety team should be hand-picked and specifying specific people and saying, hey, would you be interested in doing this thing? Because if you don't explicitly choose people, often this responsibility falls back to marginalised members who have been oppressed, who have dealt with issues that they want to prevent happening in future. And so they're going to step up to make the community better for themselves, but they don't necessarily have as much energy to do that as people who aren't dealing with that oppression or marginalisation. So as I said in previous slides, also the Code of Conduct Committee should be listed in reporting instructions so that people know who will be handling their report. And it should be usually a handful of people on the team. Some recommendations that I've seen are to have between 3 and 6 people, and replacing them with an overlap such that you might, have people replaced every 6 months, but only replace half of the team. That way you've got that knowledge that is being passed on, rather than just starting a clean slate and not having people who are aware of what's happened in the past 6 to 12 months. And ideally, a committee of this type should be a diverse group of people, which should include marginalized folks who are familiar with oppression, but are also supported by outspoken people who are likely to take reports seriously and follow through, and respected community members, which will increase the chances the community will accept any decisions that the committee makes. So when it comes to communicating within the community and within the committee, communication ideally should be done via an efficient channel such as instant messaging. This is particularly relevant for in-person events or events that are happening over a weekend, like this online conference, to deal with stuff that pops up urgently. Ideally, it makes sense to also trade contact details of people within the committee so that they can contact each other outside of that chat if necessary. It's worth thinking about who will communicate code of conduct committee decisions to the rest of the community, and who will review these kinds of updates. So are you going to delegate a chairperson of your code of conduct committee who is the spokesperson, and who will, send emails out to the mailing list and say, hey, we've had an incident and this is what we've done about it? And are you going to have somebody who sits behind them and just double checks that what they're sending out makes sense? And how are you going to sign off those updates? Are you going to sign them off as, the Code of Conduct Committee, or as the organising committee of the event? Thinking carefully about that kind of stuff is important. Inevitably, if you have to make decisions as a Code of Conduct Committee and announce them, some people are going to disagree with those decisions. And it's worth keeping in mind that in most communities, there are some members who have got nothing better to do than to argue and to pick apart the decisions that people have made. And it's worth remembering that everything is better in everything is 20/20 in hindsight, and the committee needs to think about their decisions, but also, for the most part, should be able to stand by them. And you don't necessarily have a lot of time and effort available to go and argue with people who have disagreed with your decision. So entering dialogue about decisions also dilutes their resolution, and it can cause stress and exasperation, and it could cause you to make mistakes. If you're discussing the resolution of an incident over email on a mailing list, for example, you might end up accidentally sharing too much detail about it, which might cause the participants in the incident to be identified, which you don't want. And there's potential for a lot of bike shedding, where people are going to talk about how this should be handled and how this shouldn't be handled, and ultimately those people are not likely to be on your conduct team, because the people of the conduct team have been chosen very specifically, and their decisions need to be trusted for the most part. Charles's Rules of Argument is a good guide for this kind of thing. And for the purposes of this kind of communication, the basic tenets are that you should avoid engaging with strong disagreements, await people's initial reactions to an announcement. If necessary, post a response once to follow up and clarify. So, wait for any feedback and then respond to all of them in one fell swoop. Don't provide additional detail about the incidents or their response. Avoid entering one-on-one arguments, and redirect any community-wide discussions that are happening on a mailing list or a public chat room or whatever. Redirect them to smaller venues to limit their impact and ensure that everything doesn't end up in a huge argument. So to summarize that section, it makes sense to prominently publish your code of conduct, your incident reporting procedure, and the list of committee members. Committee should be supported by leadership, and it should be a handful of members who are, who have been oppressed, who are outspoken, and who are well respected by the community. it makes sense to publish your outcomes of your code of conduct incidents. And if you have to follow up to clarify anything, try and do so only once, and then basically refrain from additional discussion. So when it comes to responding to an incident, we'll go into a little bit more detail about crafting incident response guides, which will outline the process to follow when responding to an incident as they arise. Okay, so when it comes to developing an incident response guide, it's worth investigating existing guides to see what's available. There is one on the Geek Feminism Wiki, but there are a bunch of other ones that I'm going to link to in the references section. Treating an incident response guide like a legal code is going to get you in trouble, because you're likely to encounter issues where something doesn't quite adhere to the code of conduct, or doesn't quite breach the code of conduct, or doesn't quite fit into a neat box. And so you need to be able to adapt to that kind of thing. You know, when it comes to laws, they have been very carefully thought out, and they are, you know, pages and pages and pages and pages long. You don't necessarily have the time and energy to go and develop something quite that refined. So being a little bit flexible in the way you interpret your guide may be important. In your guide, it makes sense to commit to deadlines for responses and resolutions. Dealing with incident responses can be really exhausting, and it's stressful, and it's hard work, and we don't necessarily really want to be doing it, but we do want to have our communities be safe. And as a result, because we don't necessarily want to be doing it, it's sometimes hard to overcome the desire to drag our feet a little bit and just sit on things and think about them and not necessarily take action. So having clear deadlines that we have committed to are really important to push us into action to actually resolve these things in a timely manner. Publish an overview of your response process so that people have a bit of an idea of what's going to happen if they submit a report and how it's going to be handled. And mention that you have an internal guide, but don't necessarily publish the internal guide. Again, people might then want to go and pick your internal guide apart and say, oh, why are you doing this? Or why have you got this decision in there? And, you know, and they might try and get really specific. And again, you don't necessarily have the time to go and put so much detail in there that it looks like a law book. It should also include information about how to address non-unanimous decisions. So if you've got 6 people on your team and 5 people think that you should respond to an issue in this way, but one person disagrees, how do you deal with that? What happens if 3 people have one decision and 3 people think the other? You know, what process have you got for resolving those uncertainties? It makes sense to record any responses that you make to incidents, de-anonymized so that you don't have all the information about the participants, but having a history of here is how we responded to this type of incident can help to inform how you respond to them in future, or maybe how you don't respond to them because that turned out not to work as well as you would have liked. And you need to be prepared to update your incident response guide and the policy where necessary. You may find that it doesn't cover a particular instance of something that's come up, and you need to be able to adapt it on the fly. And, one might argue that changing something in the middle of an incident is not necessarily, ideal, but sometimes it might be worth you thinking about doing. There may be no other option. So I wouldn't be afraid of doing that too much. So let's talk about actually responding to an incident report. This is, there are plenty of different ways to do this, but this is one process that I have seen used. So step 1 is to start your deadline clock to make sure that, if you've committed to announcing that an incident has occurred online, so an incident happens. If you have committed to announcing that incidents have occurred on your mailing list or whatever, it makes sense to set a deadline to do that. Say, okay, we're going to do that within 3 hours. Or we are dealing with this issue. We've heard about this thing that has happened at our event and we're dealing with it. So set yourself a timeline for when does this need to be done by. And then you might commit, for example, to 3 days of having an issue completely resolved. But timelines are variable. It depends on your event or your community. Have a think about what's going to work best, but set those timelines in a way that will work for you. Once you've started your deadline clock, having specified those times in your process, check that everyone is safe, and do what needs to be done in order to ensure that is the case. Ensure that the report is written down. It may already be written down. You may have received it in writing. But if it's not, if you've received it verbally, just make sure that somebody has written down what is going on. Because our brains are not great when it comes to pressure sometimes, and we can forget little details. So write it down as soon as you can. If you have to make an announcement, so for example, if an incident happened at an event and there were a few people around who saw it or might have witnessed it, it might make sense to say, hey, we know that this thing happened. We are working on resolving it, just so that people know that it's not slipped under the radar. And finally, for this section, make sure that anybody on your conduct team doesn't have a conflict of interest with the people involved in the incident, and if so, suggest that they step aside or ask them to step aside from this particular incident. Once you've done all of that, you can organise a committee meeting for the conduct committee or the safety team to have a bit of a chat about how this issue gets dealt with. So start setting a schedule and an agenda for that. Do any additional research. That might be going to talk to other people to get some more information from them without revealing too much information about what you know. And then once you've got all of the information that you need, meet as a committee, choose a response, and take action. Now, when it comes to responses, one bit of advice that I've seen used is to have a list of approved responses. So here are responses that we've thought about and we can see that they work well for this particular type of incident. And having a list of responses to avoid. So you might have on your list of responses to avoid, you might say, we're going to avoid, suggesting mediation or requesting somebody to apologize because we know that those don't work. Having these lists of things that we are comfortable responding with and things that we are going to avoid helps to make decisions when you are not thinking particularly clearly because you're under stress. Some incidents can be pretty harrowing, and when you're trying to enjoy an event and are dealing with an incident, it's a little tricky sometimes to think straight about what should work. So having those lists is really useful. Once you've chosen an action and taken it, inform the target of the incident and the harasser, or the perpetuator of the incident. Let them know of the response. Communicate that response to others. So that might be, hey, we saw this person who did this thing, and we have ejected this person from the event because this was a serious thing, or whatever. Like just letting people know that there are consequences and that you have dealt with the thing helps to reinforce that the code of conduct is meaningful. And then you respond to any criticism that you may receive for your response. Again, respond sparingly. Make sure that your response, in steps 12 and 13, make sure that your communication and any criticism response is concise and unambiguous, but don't identify any individuals involved. Okay. So to summarize that section, there's a lot here. So the response guide is just that. It is a guide. It's not a legal code. If you think of it as a legal code, as I said, you're going to get into trouble and it's going to be really exhausting. Committing to deadlines is really helpful because it makes sure that you keep yourself accountable to deal with things in a timely manner. Probably avoid publishing your internal process because people will nitpick at it, but publish an overview if necessary. Keep records of your incident responses. Update documentation where necessary, even if that means doing so during an incident. Maintain the safety of the targets and of the wider community. communicate any outcomes that are taken, and respond cautiously to criticism. So just on the topic of some codes of conduct, this table is from a study that was done in 2017 on codes of conduct used in open source communities. I've detailed the reference in more detail at the end of the slides. It lists some popular code of conducts in descending order of popularity according to hits on GitHub. So these are the Contributor Covenant, the Open Code of Conduct, the Python, Citizen, Ubuntu, Django, and Geek Feminism codes of conduct. And you can see there that the Contributor Covenant has almost 44,000 hits on GitHub alone. So these are some codes of conduct that you might be interested in looking at. We're going to have a bit of a look here at the Contributor Covenant, given its popularity. So it's used by over 44,000, or almost 44,000 communities around the world. And it's an example of a pretty good code of conduct. So this is the unacceptable behavior section of the Contributor Covenant. And it says that the use of unacceptable behavior includes the use of sexualized language or imagery and sexual attention or advances of any kind, trolling, insulting, or derogatory comments and personal or political attacks, public or private harassment, publishing others' private information, such as a physical or email address without their explicit permission, or other conduct which could be reasonably considered inappropriate in a professional setting. So this is a clear list of unacceptable behavior that is, I think, fairly unambiguous. And the last point there, other conduct which could be considered reasonably inappropriate, could be used if you have not necessarily thought to include something. And there are, you could go into excruciating detail about unacceptable behavior, but I think at some point, we need to come down to what is reasonable. So the scope of the Contributor Covenant, this is also listed at the top of their document, says that it applies within all community spaces and also applies when an individual is officially representing the community in public spaces. Examples of representing a community include using an official email address, posting via an official social media account, or acting as an appointed representative at an online or offline event. And they also go into a little bit of detail about their process, which I've abbreviated significantly. But they say that instances of unacceptable behavior may be reported to the community leaders responsible for enforcement at some contact method that you specify in your version of this code of conduct. Community leaders will follow these community impact guidelines to determine the consequences for any action they deem in violation of the code of conduct. So they've got 4 things listed here: correction, warning, temporary ban, or permanent ban. In the actual Contributor Covenant, they've got more detail under each of those points. So this is clearly defining what's going to happen if we receive a conduct report and how we're going to deal with it. So this hits most of the recommendations for a code of conduct. It doesn't have space to list the individuals handing reports, but if you were to adopt it, you could easily add that in. It doesn't explicitly promise to avoid conflicts of interest, but again, you could add that in. And it does include a pledge to behave constructively. So, which is to say that people who agree to this code of conduct are agreeing to behave in a constructive way. So, the conclusion for this section is that this is the conclusion for my entire talk. We've talked about what a code of conduct is and what it should contain, how to apply a code of conduct, how to respond to an incident, and we've reviewed the Contributor Covenant, which is a good example of a code of conduct. So I'm going to finish up by showing you my enormous reference slide. So a lot of this talk, a lot of the specific detailed processes in this talk have been derived from How to Respond to Reports of Code of Conduct Violations by Val Aurora and Mary Gardner. But other excellent resources also include Sage Sharp's GitHub repository Code of Conduct template, which this is a link which you can pull from the slide deck if you like. And Sage Sharp can also be hired to run workshops on codes of conduct, on how to develop them and implement them in your company or community via their company, Otter Tech. Their website is otter.technology. I found a couple of papers discussing codes of conduct. It's still a relatively new research topic from what I can tell. The one that I found the most information in was Codes of Conduct by Open Source Project, which is the one from which I linked that table in earlier slides. And then there's various other information here as well. So I'm going to leave it there with 9.5 minutes to go and take any questions that people have got.
Thank you, Matt, for that very useful talk. We have a few questions for you. So the first question is, when I have the right screen in front of me, you talk about not being able to apply codes of conduct outside the community, but are there situations where a code of conduct should cover behavior outside the community? For example, if someone stalks a member of the community using outside platforms, is it reasonable for the code of conduct to cover that?
If both of the people involved in the situation, so that the person being stalked and the stalker are part of the community, then yes, perhaps it does make sense to exclude this harmful person from the community, because they are demonstrating that they are harming some other person. So you don't, if you can avoid it, you want to try and avoid that person doing similar things to other people in your community. The main point that I was getting at around application outside of the community is that if, you've got a community member who is being harassed by somebody who's not part of the community, or, is acting as a spokesperson for the community on social media or whatever, and is harassed by somebody else, then obviously your code of conduct has no power there. But, so for that stalker scenario, like, all you can do, the only way you can address that is to exclude that person from your community, or, you have to be able to send any further stuff to, to authorities, to the police or whatever, to deal with, and it's also worth noting that when it comes to like reporting stuff to emergency services, unless there are people who are actually in imminent danger, it's worth checking with the person who is reporting this that they want you to do that first, because there may be reasons they don't want that. But when it comes to like, a stalker or that kind of thing, you don't have a huge amount of power except to exclude them from your community. So you need to be able to handball, the broader components of that issue to the law or whatever. I hope that makes sense.
I think I could follow that mostly. It's a tough situation.
It really is.
The next question is, have you run into issues around privacy or allegations/defamation accusations in relation to announcements about conduct decisions? What kind of steps to avoid that have you seen in the past?
Have I run into issues around privacy? Sorry, can you repeat the beginning of the question? It was a bit lengthy.
Have you run into issues around privacy or allegations/defamation accusations in relation to announcements about conduct decisions?
I don't think I've run into any of them personally. I suspect if you were to, I suspect that there are instances of this. If you have a look at Val Aurora's book, there are various examples in the back of that. I don't recall whether any of them cover this, but again, it limited in what you can do. So the things that need to be considered are, at all costs, the conduct team should avoid identifying anybody who's involved in an incident, unless it is detrimental to the community to not do so. So if you have to say, if you're excluding somebody from the community, and saying, this person has been kicked out of this event, you don't necessarily need to identify them. But if you don't have the power to do that or something similar, it may be worthwhile identifying the person so people know to steer clear of them. But ideally you want to try and avoid that. And thinking carefully about the language that you would use for that is obviously also important. I'm going to kill my timer because I don't need that anymore. Yeah, that's a tricky question to answer. I don't know whether I've done it justice.
Our next question is, I often face people telling me, oh, we don't need a code of conduct for various organizations. Any recommendations to get leadership to buy into the value?
Yes. So I suspect plenty of these references would give you information about why it is important. What have we got here? I'm just looking at my reference list. So Val Aurora and Mary Gardner's book is good. I think that Sage Sharp also has some information on their website, probably about why codes of conduct are important. The Code of Conduct Handbook that's listed there as well probably has info in it. But the short answer, I mean, it is tricky to get that buy-in if people aren't already open to it. And I'd be happy to talk about that more offline if we've got a little bit some more specific details about what kind of arguments people have had against it. But in short, people, codes of conduct keep people safe, and there was one of the papers that I didn't list here was about attraction, retention, and repulsion, and codes of conduct, help people feel invited into your community if they can see that they're going to be kept safe in that community because there is a code of conduct and it is being implemented. It's easy to say, oh, we don't need a code of conduct, but how do you know that people are not opting out of your community or are not keeping quiet because you don't have one? And sure, they're a lot of work, but I think the effort is worth it.
I agree. Our next question is, the asker often faces people being uncertain about what or when to report. Any recommendations to get participant buy-in?
Look, the general rule that I would use is if you are in any way thinking about reporting something, report it. Being open about who is on your code of conduct team and trying to make them, welcoming and, for example, in the past, LinuxConf have had the people in the code of conduct team stand up in the plenary theater so that people can identify them by face, and do their best to make sure that that community is welcoming and that there are plenty of ways to contact them via phone, via email, via, other mediums. Making it easy for people to report things and explicitly stating that it is okay to report something even if you are not sure. It's better for us to know that a thing has happened, even if it doesn't turn out to be a big deal or something that we can do anything about. It's worth us knowing about them, and reporting it isn't the end of the world. Just we can, decide not to do something about an incident, but we can't make that call if we don't know about it. And the other thing to keep in mind is, if you experience something that made you feel uncomfortable, you might be able to say, oh, I'm just going to brush it off. I'll just deal with it. But what about if somebody else, if the person who helped you experience that does the same to somebody else? It is sometimes hard to report stuff. I totally get that. But it does also help to think about the wider community of, okay, well, I don't want this to happen to somebody else, so I'm going to report it, even if nothing comes of it, even if it wasn't the biggest deal for me. I want to at least make the organisers aware of this thing.
I think the last question we'll have time for is, what is the optimal level of complexity for a code of conduct?
I would probably look at the contributor covenant as a baseline for that. Things to think about are, how long does this take to read? How hard is it to find information in? And does it cover the top handful of scenarios that we might have to deal with in an elegant way? If your code of conduct is more than an A4 page, I think it's too long. And that may then mean that you need to split certain parts of it out. You might have put in things about, too much detail about how this has been enforced or implemented, and you might need to link off to that separate document. But yeah, keeping it relatively short and simple is ideal. But again, you need to have a bit of an idea of like clearly defining at a minimum, this is what unacceptable behavior looks like.
Great.
But yeah, check out the contributor covenant as a baseline for that.
Thank you, Matt. There is at least one more question I've got here. So everyone, if you have more questions, please head over to the Tux Theater post-talk Q&A channel, where Matt should be able to join you in a few minutes. And thank you very much again, Matt, for such a useful and practical talk on such an important topic.
No worries, my pleasure.